Hello, guys. I hope you guys are doing good. And you must have seen the thumbnail. Today, we're going to learn about the roadmap, Java developer roadmap. So, what are the things you have to learn when you're trying to learn the Java? Okay. So, so we'll just see the high level things. What are we going to learn here? Okay. So, first of all, we have to learn the fundamentals. So, fundamentals are mandatory, which we have to learn. Then we have to learn the basic syntax. Okay. And then what are the data types and variables inside the Java? Okay. And then loops. So loops like for loop, while loop. Okay. And then there will be conditional things, conditional programming like if, right? We'll learn about that. Then something called exception handling. So where how are you going to handle the exceptions whenever there is some unconditional error happens. Okay, so how the system should behave. So here we are going to learn exception handling. So then I said conditionals, right? So if condition, okay, those conditionals we'll learn about that. And then functions. So functions in Java is called something called as the what do you call methods. Okay, so we are going to learn this functions. And then we learn about the data structures. So what about the data structures? So so whenever as a student, okay, so whenever you're going for an interview, okay, the first thing which what you have to get is that you have to get something called a programming language. Then the next thing which uh, will be expecting from a candidate is the data structures. We learn about the data structures once we finish about the Java. Okay, then something called OOPS, interfaces and classes, and then we learn something called packages. Okay, and then we learn something called working with files and APIs. Okay, so once you learn all these things, okay, so when you have to go get into the deeper, right? So what we learn is we learn something called memory management, how the memory management is happening internally. And then you learn something called collection framework. This is very important when you're going for any interviews. Memory management, collection framework, right? So these are very important. Like you learn about different types of list, set, map. Excuse me. Sorry for that. And then you'll learn something called serialization. The serialization is nothing but so whenever you're trying to transfer your object over the network, how are you going to handle the object? Okay, and there's something called networking and sockets. You learn about networking and sockets. Okay, and then we learn about IBM internal working. Okay, this is not that much important, but we learn about this. And then we'll something called garbage collection. How are we going to handle garbage collection? And then when you're going for any experience interviews, right, you learn something called threads. Okay, threads, how are you going to handle threads? Okay, that is something called concurrent. And then you learn something called generics, streams, and lambda. So lambda is one of the feature of Java 8. Okay, we learn about lambda. So whenever once you finish this, the next thing what you learn is something called so a build tool. What is a build tool? Build tool is nothing but so so generally when you're working with a common code, right, or what you call a common core Java, you need a very basic jars which is already available with the JDK and JVM. Okay, now if you are trying to work with something called Spring Boot or Hibernate or Servlets, JSP, right, we need jars. So to handle those jars, okay, we need something called build tools. Okay, so build tools can help us to work the I mean it will help us to finish the work soon. Okay, so we have something called Gradle, Maven, and Ant. Okay, initially we were developing with the Ant. Nowadays people actually go with Gradle or Maven. Okay, and then you learn something called web frameworks. So under the web frameworks you learn about Spring Boot. So play framework we'll see later, and struts. Okay, and from the JDBC, what we will learn is what is JDBC? JDBC is nothing but it is Java database connectivity. Okay, so you have a database, you have your Java core Java. Okay, now this core Java, how it is going to connect to your database. So that is where Java database connectivity. Okay. So there's something called ORM. ORM is nothing but object relationship mapping. Okay. So what is this object relationship mapping? So what happens is when you're working with JDBC, okay, so it is like you're completely you're dependent on the SQLs, whatever the SQL. So for example, you're working with Oracle, okay, you have to write Oracle based queries, okay, and if you're working with different, so this is completely based on the queries. Java database connectivity is completely based on the queries. Now you want to overcome the queries, and you are completely dependent on the POJO class, object relationship mapping. So what there is a concept of entity, okay, on your object POJO class. On your POJO class, you will override or you will mention the annotations. So internally, sorry, give me some time. What will happen is, sorry for that. Sorry for that. So what will happen is your object, it will try to connect to the database using some annotations, and we need to do some configuration. Okay, that's where your Hibernate will help us. Okay, and once you finish your coding, what you do is you test your APIs. Okay, sorry for that. How do you test your APIs? So either of this, either use your Mockito. So once you write your testing right code, right, you have to test your code. So that's where you will use something called JUnits. So that JUnits is nothing but Mockito. Okay, JUnit and Mockito. What is JMeter here is, so you have written your code, okay, but how your code is performing, okay, that will be done using the JMeter. Okay, so we learn about even JMeter in the going forward videos. Nothing but there's something called logging frameworks. Okay, so generally I was showing you one of the videos. I was showing you system.out.println. Okay, so this system.out.println is not a recommended way to print the logs in the uh, production environment. Okay, so what we do instead, right? We use something called logging frameworks. Either we use Log4j2, SLHJ4G, Logback. Okay, we will learn about this. Either one of them will be used in your uh, industry. Okay, so we will learn what are we going to learn in the Java core foundation. Okay, so we will learn something called data types, variables, and operators under the core language. Okay, and then we learn something called control statements. It will be either if or switch or loops. Okay, then we learn something called arrays and strings, and then we learn something called wrapper classes. So what are wrapper classes? So you have something called primitive types, right? Like int, integer, all those things. So for that, for each and every primitive types, we have wrapper classes. So once we finish this, we'll learn something called classes and objects. And then we learn inheritance. And then we learn polymorphism, abstraction, encapsulation. So final, static, this, and super keywords. Okay. And then we learn something called exceptional handling. So checked versus unchecked exception, try catch finally. Okay. And then we learn something called custom exceptions. And what are the best practices? Once we finish this, we will move on to something called Java memory basics. So where we'll have something called stack versus heap. And we learn something called garbage collection basics. And we learn something called finalize keyword. Okay. Okay, next thing, what is the next phase? What are we going to learn? So once we finish this with this basic foundation, right? Once we are strong with the basic foundation, okay, we will move on to phase two, where you learn something called core plus modern Java, that is mandatory. So we learn something called collection framework. Another collection framework, you will learn list, set, and map. And what is the difference between array list and linked list? What is the difference between hash map and concurrent hash map? what is tree map, what is linked hash map. Don't worry about all these things. We will go slowly one by one topic. We will learn each and everything, and then we learn something called generics. Okay, what is meant by generic, what is bounded types, what is wildcards. Okay, and then, so here comes the important thing, which is Java 8 features. So currently Java is growing, Java is releasing the versions rapidly. So currently we are with Java 25 plus, okay, as of now. Okay, and it is going to release more features in the near future. So for each with each and every version, it is going to add new features to the Java. So Java 8 was one of the uh, version where it has completely changed the coding of the Java. Okay, so where it was introduced with Lambda expressions, functional interfaces, streaming API, optional and method references. Okay, we learn about these things when we come to this topic. Once we finish this, here comes the uh, multi-threading and concurrency. So this is very important. Okay, not only for the senior level interviews, even for the freshers. So people ask, what is thread lifecycle? What is the difference between runnable and callable? What is synchronization? What is volatile? Okay, what are locks? What is executor framework? Okay, and completable future and concurrent collections. Once we finish this, we'll deep dive into the JVM architecture. Okay, what is the JVM architecture? What are class loading mechanisms? Okay, what is garbage collectors, and how are you going to tune your memory? Okay, what is OOM errors, performance profiling, tunings, everything. Okay, once we finish this, we will learn about uh, Java, IO, NIO, and networking. Okay, so this is the place where you are going to how is your uh, I mean coding is working. I mean, how is your code is performing over the network. Okay, so we learn about file IO, serialization, NIO basics, sockets, REST client basics. Fine. Finally, once we finish with the uh, core Java topics, right, we will move on to something called Spring ecosystem. So Java alone is not enough in real projects. What we needed is we needed something called Spring and frameworks. What is a framework? The commonly occurring problems across the different uh, projects is been come up with some solution. That is nothing but a framework. So the framework is nothing but, earlier I told you, Hibernate framework, right? That is one thing, and then is something called Spring framework, Spring Boot framework. Okay, so these are the commonly occurring problem across the projects has been come up with a solution. So where we have something called Spring Boot. Okay, Spring Boot, Spring. We will learn about first. We learn about Spring, where we learn about IOC, this inversion of control and dependency injection. Then we learn something called Bean lifecycle. What are the annotations? Okay, and then Spring Boot is an extension to the Spring. So where Spring was more with the XML wise XML, right? It was working with XML. The configuration was happening with the XML. Then Spring Boot came, where it has completely changed the coding style, where we generally go with the annotation based things. Okay, so we learn about auto configuration, we learn about profilings, we learn about externalizing configuration. Okay, Acquitator. Here comes where you will move on to the how are you going to develop your Spring MVC and REST. So there are some risk principles. Okay, we will see. And there's something called controllers. Okay, there's something called exceptional handling, validation. Okay, there's something called Spring Data JPA. We'll learn about that. You learn about ORM frame concepts like object, right? As I told you, there's something called Hibernate and JBQL, pagination and sorting. So once you finish with all these things, what you learn the next thing is